There's a sort of classic argument that as demand for a product goes down, a product that's got a lot of production, in other words, as demand for that goes down, there's a dip in the price, which causes it to temporarily become more popular. But will oil follow that trend or not? Jeff Shelley questions that logic. Let's take a look. For those of you interested in investing, check out WeBull, an amazing platform for buying and selling stocks, and now cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, Dogecoin, and others. Open an account and get a free stock valued at up to $200, and fund your account and get another free stock valued at up to $1,600. Check out the link in the description and help the channel at the same time. Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. So I want to talk today about an article or an op-ed piece that Jeff Shelley posted to InsideEVs recently. I think it's really interesting to look at the EV adoption curve for the next 5 to 10 years and see whether some things that we think historically might have an impact on the EV adoption curve will actually have that impact or not. So that's what Jeff is talking about. I'm going to put a link to his article, of course, that you should take a look at yourself in the description, but I'm going to kind of touch on the main points that he talks about here, and then of course include my own thoughts. The title of the article is, How Will the EV Effect Impact the Oil Industry, Gas Prices? Perhaps EV adoption will push gasoline prices to all-time lows. Interestingly enough, Jeff's point is actually that this won't happen, but it's always interesting how people title videos and articles and things like that. I recently did a whole episode about that and how clickbait has taken over YouTube, and people really disliked it. It was very interesting because I just wanted to discuss why things have gotten so kind of hysterical on YouTube in terms of all caps and big giant, fires and explosions in thumbnails and stuff. And people apparently did not appreciate the fact that I talked about that very much. So anyway, it was like, I think the only time in a very, very long time that I've had negative subscriber growth in a day. So that was very bizarre because I was like, hey, I'm explaining what's going on here, and people apparently didn't like that. Anyway, if you're interested, you should definitely catch that episode. It was rather interesting, I thought. It goes into psychology and the reasons why people tend to gravitate to titles like that and to thumbnails like that. But anyway, that aside, let's talk about what Jeff had to say in this article. So his main question in this article is, will oil prices dip so much that ICE cars will become temporarily like a better deal in the next 4 or 5 years? So right now, EVs are already a better deal than internal combustion or ICE vehicles over the long haul. If you purchase the car, you pay for the car, you do the maintenance and the fueling and all energy, whatever it is, you add that all up, and then you resell the car at the end. An EV car, especially a Tesla, is much, much more affordable than is an ICE car. The problem right now is that the sticker price for internal combustion engine cars are significantly lower than EV cars are right now. It's not as much as you might think, but they are definitely still sticker price lower. But what's going to happen, of course, is that EVs are going to continue marching down. They follow Wright's law. I did an episode on that before if you want to see that. But anyway, they're a newer type of technology, and so their cost decline is going to be much more rapid than internal combustion engine vehicles. And so that's just a given. So at some point, there's going to be price parity between EVs and ICE type cars. And at that point, there's already no reason to buy an ICE vehicle because they're more expensive to own and operate, but there's a cash flow issue. If you don't have $50,000+ to throw at a car and to pay the monthly payments or to just pay it off all at once, it's a lot cheaper to buy a $25,000 car up front. It's not cheaper to own that car over 3 or 4 or 5 years, but it seems like it's cheaper. So that is what people go for. And of course, cash flow is a big deal, right? If you don't have the extra money to pay the monthly financing bill for the car, you don't really have a choice at this point. But that is going to change over time. These things are going to come down. The sticker price is going to become price parity. And that's going to cause a huge disruption in the industry, as many people have talked about, including me. And so the standard logic here is that as more EVs get on the road, there's going to be less demand for fuel oil in order to move ICE cars around, right? So if you sell 10% fewer cars, or if there's 10% fewer ICE vehicles on the road than there were, you've got effectively a glut of gasoline because you've got more production than there is demand at this point, which means that prices are going to come down. And as Jeff posted, there's this nice sort of double S-curve thing that he had looked at, which is that the price of oil will go up, but then demand is going to go down as EV adoption rates kick in. And that means that there's going to be a kind of a dip in EV adoption rates as oil prices and gas prices are low enough that people will then say like, oh, this is actually cheaper to own an internal combustion engine vehicle than it is to own an ICE car. That is a masking function that won't hold long term, but in a short term, that could happen. And Jeff argues against this logic. So basically the logic is the more EVs there are, the less fuel demand there is, the lower the fuel costs for a period of time, and the lower the effective cost of owning an ICE car appears to be in a short-term window. And there are always consumers who are thinking about the short-term window. And if we take some historical antecedents, you can think about like CDs or DVDs or even floppy disks. If you remember those things, the little guys, well, the ones that were actually floppy, but then the ones that were in the plastic thing that you would put in the old like Macintoshes and PCs. So they started off at a very high price and then they came down a little bit over time as there was manufacturing that took place. And then what happened was as those technologies became outdated, the price of them dropped drastically. So for a period of time, you could buy floppy disks, like boxes and boxes of these things for almost no money whatsoever. And so it was like, wow, okay, so the floppy disk is very inexpensive to purchase for this period of time. And then of course people stopped manufacturing floppy disks and also CDs. There are still DVDs that are being produced out there, so they're still in that kind of depressed stage right now. But if you want to go buy an old style 1980s or 90s floppy disk, it's going to cost you a lot of money at this point because hardly anybody makes it anymore. Maybe impossible to find those things at this point. But anyway, so there's like this dip, right? So there's a price that's kind of flat for a while, and then as demand goes down, but production is still there, you get a dip in price, and then eventually the production stops because there's no money to be made, and the price goes up kind of ad infinitum at that point. But anyway, the idea would be that oil would do the same thing. As there's less demand, the oil price will kick down significantly and people will say like, excellent, that's really nice. I can own a car or I could purchase a new ICE car and it's cheaper than an EV. Again, this is not something that's going to last forever. It's just a period of time and then it's going to go up very, very steeply eventually as there's just not so much production anymore because there's no demand for it. So then the price will go up very, very rapidly. But Jeff's question is this the way things are actually going to play out? What's different about oil? Well, he talks about inelastic demand and fixed costs, which are two things from, if you've ever taken a basic economics class, those are things that I'm sure you have heard about, in addition, of course, to the supply-demand X that gets formed, right? So you have the supply and you have the demand and those things meet in the middle, and that sets the cost of a product. So as people see it, oil is an inelastic demand product, right? You have to use gas to get around, assuming you have a nice car. So you buy that gas no matter what the cost it is. And that sucks for you as a consumer. Believe me, I know, as you know, I remember gas going up to $4 or $5 locally, and I'm sure people in Europe are like, oh gosh, that's super cheap. But anyway, you know, it became a high cost, and so it became a large percentage of the cost of just staying alive, right? You have to get to the grocery store, you have to get to work, etc. So you have to pay that money. So it's inelastic. It's the kind of thing where you're just like, well, I'm gonna have to suck it up and pay more and sacrifice somewhere else in order to keep this going. It's also quasi-inelastic if it goes down. People tend to not go crazy and say like, oh, I'm gonna do a 2,000-mile road trip just because gas is cheaper right now. That's not the kind of thing they do. So oil, you know, the demand for gas stays reasonably the same. Now, of course, what happened during the 2020 pandemic was a complete like oddball case because suddenly people didn't have to go to work anymore. So all of a sudden you had a gigantic drop in demand and you had a huge glut temporarily in the cost of oil and gas. And I'm not arguing about anything here short term. I'm sure Jeff is not arguing about that either. He's not saying that, you know, tomorrow the cost of oil is going to go up or something. He's talking about 4 or 5 years or 10 years from now. So we're not looking at short-term trends. Oil is incredibly volatile and it will go up and down in the short term. What we're talking about here is 5 to 10 year trends. So anyway, that's inelastic demand for you. Fixed cost means costs that are sunk into a business. So that can be salaries, it can be factory space, it could be computers. For oil, it has to do with a lot with the mining equipment and also research and development of where the heck, you know, new oil sources are and so, etc. And so those are all kind of sunk into the business. So because you've got these fixed costs, you have two solutions to, you know, making a profit in your business. That is sell more or sell higher. And that means sell more product, right? So more oil, or raise the price of that oil. And so now that we have this setup taken care of, let's go on to Jeff's point. Going EV is inelastic, not elastic. And what he means by that is that people don't want to go back and buy an ICE car after getting an EV. I know this is true for me, though more evidence, if he had had this backed up by some scientific survey that showed this, or at least some anecdotal survey, that would have been useful. But certainly the people that I know tend to agree with that point. We're just going to have to take that as a given for now for this. It's an op-ed piece, so he's not trying to do an actual scientific survey, but let's just assume that this is true for the moment. I think it is personally. I think that there probably is evidence out there. But anyway, what that means is that when people go EV, they don't tend to go back again. And I definitely have remembered seeing surveys of like Tesla in particular that it's around 90%, so 9 out of 10 people who buy a Tesla are not going to go and buy a BMW or a Mercedes or even a Toyota Corolla or something. They're not going to go back to ICE cars after owning a Tesla in particular. And that should hold true for most of the EV world. So even other companies that are making EVs, that same sort of tendency to stick with them after purchasing them should also be true. So Jeff then talks about, what if we have a 10% EV adoption rate at some point in the future, right? That means that there's 10% less oil demand for driving. There's of course still other demands, but let's just keep it simple. So we'll just talk about driving. What do you do at that point as an oil company? Do you increase production when you have a 10% reduction in the global demand? That's not a very good idea, because that's just going to create a glut in the market. Do you decrease production? Well, that's really not going to make a difference to EV owners because they have inelastic demand. They're not interested in going back to an ICE car, no matter what the temporary cost of gas is. So then do you reduce salaries or other fixed costs? Well, that's extremely difficult and unpalatable to these companies. Do you raise prices? Well, this does seem like the best solution in the short term. But this means that gas prices actually go up right at a time when people are looking at EVs versus ICE cars. And hey, guess what that means? That makes EVs even more attractive to own. And that's a positive feedback loop we've just established. More EV adoption leads to higher gas prices, leads to consumers wanting to save money, so they won't want to buy an ICE car, which means more EV adoption. And what this means is that double S-curve thing with the dip in oil prices is actually not likely to happen after all, which means that EV adoption is likely to follow the single S-curve rather than the double S-curve style, which means this is going to happen just as fast as people like Tony Seba and others are predicting. But wait, we can continue on. As Jeff says, this can have another rather drastic effect. Owning, not buying, but simply operating an ICE car will become prohibitively expensive. Gas will simply cost too much, even if you own the car outright. And also, I will add that service shops will begin closing as well, so service costs are going to rise as well. So what this means is that people will not hold on to their cars for 10 to 15 years, but will start dumping them after 5 or 6 or 7 or something like that years, right? They'll get rid of the car much more quickly than they would have previously because the car simply costs too much to operate. And if it costs too much to operate and you can buy an EV and basically do it for almost a price parity or even a little bit less over time with the EV, there's no reason why people are going to keep these cars, which means we're going to have giant graveyards of ICE cars eventually. And of course, the used car market will collapse. And of course, the legacy ICE market will collapse as well. So these are all huge things to think about, but it means that this could happen much more quickly than people are giving it credit to. Finally, Jeff ends with a question about developing countries. Will they need oil so much that this will stave off a complete collapse in the oil industry for the midterm, let's say into the 2030s at least? I predict that this will not happen. I'm going to take the telephone as a good sort of historical antecedent. Developing countries in many cases skipped the whole build a giant wired grid step for landline phones and went straight to cell phone service, which takes much less infrastructure as there is no last mile to build out necessary, right? You don't have to build all of these wires. They're very expensive, right? Copper wires going from all of these main switchers and telephones out to individual houses. That costs a ton of money. So cell phones are much, much more efficient in terms of capital and in terms of building infrastructure. You get a lot more bang for the buck. So my prediction is that many of these countries, once sticker prices are the same between ICE and EV cars, are going to just outright opt for EVs as they are cheaper. They can be powered locally, like via solar or wind or something, and they're much, much cleaner. Now, the cleaner aspect may not be as important for developing countries, although it should be, but certainly things like not having to build an infrastructure of gas stations everywhere, not having to have, these horrible polluting things buried in the ground, being able to do things like local power production so that you can actually power these vehicles locally. All of those things lead to a cheaper, more efficient type of system for transportation. So these countries may actually skip over the whole like buying lots and lots of gas-powered engine cars and go straight to EVs, even though of course in larger cities they've already got a lot of gas infrastructure. Out in more rural areas they will not have that, and so they can skip straight to EVs, and that's going to actually be a huge benefit to them. And of course, as China has shown, you can build ultra cheap EVs if you want to. They're not the safest things in the world and they don't have an awful lot of space, but you know, China has some that are only a few $1,000s already, and they sell like crazy because they're way cheaper than any ICE car that can be built right now. So that's the kind of direction we could be heading. You could have these ultra cheap cars that are being sold to developing countries, and they can just skip over the whole buying used ICE cars from other countries and the nastiness and the pollution and the service issues and all of the stuff about building out gas infrastructure and everything. And remember that it does take a lot of infrastructure to have fuel stations all over the place. Not only do you have to build these things, you have to build the gas stations and everything, you have to transport the oil, the fuel to these gas stations. So this is all a huge, giant like mess of stuff you have to do, whereas it's much, much easier if you can just charge the cars up using the sun or solar or a power grid that already exists. So will we see the double S curve with a dip in oil prices, or are oil prices going to continue to rise over the years? I think it's the latter. I think oil prices are just going to continue to go straight up. I think Jeff makes a really good case, and I think he's right, assuming that EV adopters are in fact elastic to temporary market fluctuations. Of course, oil can and will go up and down a ton in the short term. We're talking about a 5 to 10 year window here. And over that time, it's not nearly as likely as one might imagine that oil prices will actually dip significantly for a long enough time to affect consumer demand for EVs. The tipping point has been reached, folks. If you're invested in oil or legacy auto stock, you might want to think about this as you plan out your investment future. All right, I hope you enjoyed this episode and found it fun and thought-provoking, and thank you to Jeff for inspiring this episode, of course. If you enjoyed the video, please do like it so other people can find it, and of course consider subscribing for more of this. As always, a huge shout out to my patrons on Patreon. Thank you all so much. You all are wonderful. I love the conversation that we're having. I also have let it go way too long since I've done a new Patreon patron shout out, so here it is. We have Dave Ty, Gibson Bathrick, Dan Chandler, Steve Ipiana, Connecting the Dots, Drew Sherline, Niels NB, Phil Kemp, Arnold Brown, Bill Miziura, Ernst, Andy Anthony, Hans de Klerk, RG77, Dave Dewson, and one more patron. Thank you all so much for joining, and of course, if you want to join the club, definitely check out the link in the description for more information. And if you're interested in some awesome merch, check out the link in the description. We've got the Tesla Bot t-shirt, which is super popular these days. Don't mess with Tesla. Lots of other t-shirts, tumblers, mugs, etc. So check out the link in the description and help the channel out. And for those of you interested in investing, check out WeBull, an amazing platform for buying and selling stocks, and now cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, Dogecoin, and others. Open an account and get a free stock valued at up to $200, and fund your account and get another free stock valued at up to $1,600. Check out the link in the description and help the channel at the same time. Thank you. And finally, don't forget we are both Tesla and Amazon affiliates. If you look in the description, you can see how going shopping for a solar roof, a power wall, or anything on Amazon helps out the channel. And as always, feel free to ask me questions in the comments or at my email address, which is drknowitallknows@gmail.com. Till next time, bye-bye.